Welcome back to the Controversy Corner, Boils and Ghouls. In this series, we examine lawsuits, frauds, feuds, and other unsavory events having to do with the comic book industry. And this episode is a special one. Arthur Suydam was once one of comics' most promising and respected artists. After decades of working his way up the ranks from a teenage hire at DC by Joe Orlando and reaching underground prominence with his work in both Epic Illustrated and Heavy Metal, Arthur Suydam finally reached the pinnacle of the industry after his work on Marvel Zombies in 2006. While a number of things helped Suydam stand out on the stands at the time, his knack for contorting the images of some of comics' most famous covers into bizarrely twisted and humorously grotesque homages would both skyrocket him into stardom and be the eventual cause of his downfall as well. It wasn't long after the massive success of Marvel Zombies, which Suydam did with Walking Dead scribe Robert Kirkman during his own rise to superstardom, that Suydam began to seemingly self-immolate. Suydam regularly began being accused of a host of sordid deeds almost immediately following his rise to prominence after nearly 3 decades in the industry, mostly stemming from his liberal usage of elements and compositions from other people's work without proper accreditation. As a result, it would be less than 10 years later that Arthur Suydam was basically run out of the comic book industry proper by an angry mob of fellow industry professionals fed up with his ego and antics, and a growing number of disillusioned and angry former fans who had began to increasingly resent a number of things about the once prominent artist. One of the biggest names in modern comics for a brief time, finding out exactly what happened to Arthur Suydam, why he seems to have completely vanished from the public eye, and more importantly, why, was not easy. But tonight I present to you the full story of Arthur Suydam's troubled comic book career. So join me in this multi-part documentary series as we examine the surprising meteoric rise and eventual equally epic downfall of Arthur Suydam, the so-called Zombie King, and another tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia I like to call Arthur Suydam, the Controversy King. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of exclusive behind-the-scenes updates, uncut interviews, early access to content. You can even get your name in the credits. You can also use the Ko-Fi link in the description to make donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel, and if that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. After Tablegate, the ensuing debacle regarding his doctoring photos to make himself appear more popular, subsequently denying this fact, paying off other artists in hopes they wouldn't publicly out him for stealing their art, and what seemed like a never-ending wave of people taking to the internet to share less than favorable stories and memories of Arthur Suydam, especially at conventions and other live appearances, came to a head in 2015, landing a devastating blow to his career. There was a single Raise the Dead trade paperback collection cover illustration published in 2016. I would bet money this was commissioned long before all of this ugliness went down though, and it would be almost 2.5 years until Arthur Suydam had another piece published. This period of more than 2 years feels like him really trying to lay low and do his absolute best to avoid the spotlight while at once reclaiming his once prominent position at conventions. Then, without warning or welcome, Suydam literally reappeared out of nowhere. While the Marvel Zombies craze had certainly cooled over the years, it had never really gone away and had managed to develop enough of a readership over the years to legitimize random miniseries and one-shot specials on a rather sporadic ongoing basis from Marvel ever since their debut. After the beating that they had taken over the last few minis, as well as Suydam's fall from grace, a name which Marvel had heavily come to rely on when marketing and selling the book to both retailers and fans, they had finally taken the hint, and it had been a while since there was a Marvel Zombies book proper at least released. The universe crossed over twice with the Secret Wars series in 2016, and there had even been an attempted reboot of the series and subject matter with 2018's Marvel Zombie, which proposed to introduce Marvel's original shambling undead would-be hero Simon Garth as a central character. After about a year of radio silence on Marvel's end, DC had decided to capitalize on their absence on the stands with their own zombie series, Deceased. Just as with Marvel Zombies nearly 13 years before, in 2005, the 2019 DC series also featured homage covers. This time, however, Arthur Suydam was not asked to contribute, and the homage B covers were done by Yasmin Putri. While primarily horror images, there were other iconic movie posters that Putri did homages of. While I'm not an inordinately large fan of homages or variant covers at all for that matter, some of those covers actually were pretty cool. The Nightmare on Elm Street one was definitely my favorite, and I think it well demonstrates the marked difference between Putri's work, which uses the original Nightmare on Elm Street poster as a reference, completely reimagining aspects of the image and toying with the design rather than being slavishly tied to the original because he was tracing it or anything like that, and Suydam, who, well, had basically done exactly that. As much as I might dislike them, and despite the numerous industry professionals and seasoned collectors who had also soured on Suydam for a host of reasons over the past several years, homages had continued to exponentially explode in popularity, and Putri's Deceased covers quickly and entirely unintentionally reignited the zombie homage fad in earnest once more, though few would have suspected that Arthur Suydam would have come slinking out of his hole to try and horn in on the action after the events of 2015 and 2016. While he'd done numerous convention prints and even a few promotional posters featuring DC characters over the years, Arthur Suydam had never really tackled the publisher's characters prior to Deceased. He had done a single image for a Wizard magazine that they commissioned for an article some years prior. That single image tease had many fans clamoring for Suydam to tackle the DC universe proper, at least when the article was published during his time at the top of the food chain, that is. Despite fans, the fact I'm guessing Arthur Suydam works for what has to amount to peanuts at this point seems to basically take any assignment people are willing to pay him to do, as well as the resurgence and popularity of zombie stories in general. Despite all of this, I still don't think DC would have been caught dead hiring Arthur Suydam in 2019, all pun intended. Instead, a group of intrepid shops and retailers, either unaware of what they were signing up for or believing Suydam's side of things, banded together to commission their own set of covers for Deceased. And what better choice than the man who would become known as the Zombie King for his superhero zombie covers, a man who had spent nearly a decade crafting cover illustrations for some of the highest selling trade paperbacks of all time and the covers to the floppies that the trades reprinted. A man who had gone to a classical atelier recreation of Michelangelo and Raphael's school to study human anatomy. While Marvel and DC might have known better, Comic Madness, Comic Hero University, and Forbidden Planet had all commissioned store-exclusive covers by Suydam for the upcoming Deceased series in July of 2019. While it didn't start right away, things were about to get messy for Arthur Suydam once again as he saw himself in the headlines for lifting art. Suydam's Deceased 1 variant did little to raise eyebrows, to the extent I don't think a lot of people were even aware of its existence. It's a horrendous adaptation of Alex Ross's immortal cover to his Harley Joker one-shot. Its garish execution, along with enough people who still remembered what he had done only a few short years prior, ensured the cover not only failed to garner attention, but essentially flew completely under the radar. The cover Suydam provided for the second issue, however, disastrously fared slightly better. It was a recreation of the famous Death of Supergirl cover by George Perez for Crisis on Infinite Earth 7. While the image looked incomparably better than his first cover, this was easily explained by the fact Suydam hadn't actually done the image for the DC series in 2019. The Crisis illustration was in fact the single DC image Suydam had done during the height of his popularity, commissioned by Wizard magazine a decade and a half earlier, while everyone was still riding high on the Marvel Zombies wave. The fact that this particular painting, which had been commissioned 12 years earlier, was done for the Wizard article, and he had apparently held on to the original as well as the republishing rights for the image, explained how Suydam had managed to resell a decade-old piece as a new cover for the 2019 DC series. While he wasn't setting the world on fire, as I said, this second cover managed to attract quite a bit more attention than the first. This was far from a good thing for Arthur Suydam, who was about to be publicly crucified for what was to follow with the deceased variants. After the fairly positive reaction to the Deceased 2 Suydam variant, Forbidden Planets, who had commissioned that Crisis cover from him, asked for another. This time they wanted something new though, a play on Brian Boland's absolutely incomparable cover illustration for The Killing Joke. This time, Suydam didn't have a pre-existing decade-old image that he could just whip out and sell them. He had to actually paint something. This was problematic for Suydam, who by this point seems to have become beyond dependent on reference material to an absolutely crippling extent in a lot of cases. While Suydam probably would have just usually tossed Boland's cover art onto his computer or even a light box had he been feeling adventurous, Boland's work was simply too line-based. Suydam would have had to work out all the folds and shadows in the clothes, the camera, the lapel pins. It would have been a real headache. Instead, Suydam resorted to other tactics which would land him in some serious trouble, the likes of which he'd never seen before, unbelievably. It seems that because he couldn't directly manipulate or trace Boland's original art for his painted version, Suydam decided on another route to capture the realistic likeness he was shooting for. Arthur Suydam instead settled on using a photograph, an image of a cosplayer who had done a photo recreation of the cover as reference to achieve the desired effect. With all of the shadows and folds in the clothing, most of the heavy lifting was already taken care of for him. All Suydam would have had to do was paint what he saw. By this point, he was well beyond that though, and he went a different route for his Killing Joke homage cover. Using a cosplayer image as reference, or even straight up appropriating a lot of them, normally wouldn't have ended up biting Suydam in the butt like this did. However, the cosplayer that he chose to appropriate work from happened to be Anthony Maziano, also known by his cosplay moniker Harley's Joker. During his years of work in the field, and work that he had taken very seriously, I might add, Maziano had managed to achieve an impressive level of recognition, not only for his cover recreation photo shoots, but for his portrayal of the Joker in general as well, with many lobbying for him to play the character in a live-action Batman project at one point. It's insane when you see some of Maziano's work, and he'd achieved a great deal of his notoriety from the sheer amount of times and places that his images were shared and reposted, making him something of an internet celebrity in the process. As such, when Arthur Suydam's cover for Deceased 4 was solicited, it didn't take long for people to notice some disturbing similarities between Arthur Suydam's painted cover and Anthony Maziano's photo recreation of the Killing Joke cover. While suspicions were quickly cast, and I think a lot of people suspected something was amiss almost immediately, considering how quickly this was caught, someone under the username RD Tondro didn't just suspect that Arthur Suydam had lifted this deceased cover image from Maziano's photo, he could prove it. Rather than just make assertions or even compare certain elements of the two images, Tondro decided to instead provide irrefutable proof that Arthur Suydam had straight up taken the original image and used it for the cover he had sold the Forbidden Planets. Tanjiro created an animated GIF image which overlaid Suydam's deceased 4 homage cover with Maziano's recreation. What resulted was, with the exception of the skull and blood dripping from the camera, a pixel for pixel match. Suydam obviously hadn't even bothered to trace the image or anything. He just tossed Anthony Maziano's photograph into Photoshop, put a minimal paint effect on it, and then added the blood dripping from the camera and the skull over the Joker's face to make the cover appear like a painting. Not only had Suydam failed to fool anyone, but that skull, well, as it turned out, that was a stock photo of a skull, which had happened to be one of the top results via Google at the time, which had also had a paint effect applied and was then simply photoshopped over Maziano's face for the cover image. When Bleeding Cool broke the article on July 9th, Maziano had only just become aware that Suydam had appropriated his image for the cover. Following the article's publication, Suydam's management quickly got in touch with Anthony Maziano about the situation in an attempt to get ahead of things as the story broke across the World Wide Web. Rather than just admit what he'd done, back down, or even better yet, just paint a cover, Suydam disastrously did what he always did. He tried to pay off Anthony Maziano. Suydam, or what appears to have been his management, sent a message to the Harley's Joker page addressing the situation to Maziano directly by saying, quote, "We found one of your great homage photos online and have used it for reference to paint a Joker homage cover for DC. And we would like to pay you our usual modeling fee if you text us your name and mailing address for us to send the check to. Best, Mike." Unlike what must have been veritably every person he'd ever done this to before, Anthony Maziano didn't seem very interested in quickly submitting to a payoff check, saying in his reply to Suydam, quote, "Hi there, thank you for writing me. I've seen the image going around. I'm not sure if it's the same image you're referring to. The one I've seen does not seem like a painting. It very much appears to be a simple Photoshop manipulation, some kind of paint filter applied to my photograph. It may be a traced piece done with a tablet sampling covers from my photo, but again, only referring to the image I've seen. It lines up pixel for pixel with my image, and the colors are digitally a perfect match. That photograph of mine actually took me weeks to create. It's not just one photograph. I believe it's 8 or 9 that I used and stitched together carefully. Every individual element, even the camera strap, was very carefully staged and articulated before being photographed and edited into the final image. I've always done all of my own photography and editing in addition to the modeling. The goal being is it looks like a simple photo. You see, I've been drawing and painting since I was a child, and this is just another avenue for me to use those visual acuities. I apologize if I seem cold. I'm just very attached to my work. I hope you understand. It was funny because of all the artists that Arthur Suydam had crossed over the years, the words of a cosplayer who took his craft very seriously, obviously, feel like not only rather well stated, but something that Arthur Suydam should have heard years before. When this exchange was publicly posted, it seems things were reaching a fever pitch, but Suydam actually had the gall to respond to Maziano, himself nonetheless this time. The following statement all but drove the stake through whatever shreds of his career Arthur Suydam might have been clinging to outside of one single solitary publisher. If his statement regarding Tablegate had been condescending, I've no clue how to begin to describe his response to the Killing Joke situation. Quote, "Hi guys, one of my friends sent this to me in an email, so I guess I'll comment on this once. The assignment was to do parodies of famous DC covers, so we picked the Great Boland cover to parody. The Joker homage piece is a fully painted homage illustration, not a photo. No filters were employed in the painting process. Numerous pieces of reference were used for the piece, including some homage photos out there used as art reference for the gloves, suit, and folds in the fabric, etc. We're all doing homages to the same pieces, and all images are owned by the copyright holders, not the artists or anyone else. This on its own wasn't the game-ending totality of the wisdom that he chose to share that day, however, for some ungodly reason. Suydam felt the need to not only defend his actions, but prove to the world that he wasn't a joke, but a deadly serious artist once more. He concluded saying, quote, "Historically speaking of reference use, camera Lucy, opaque projector, photos, models, pantograph, clip art, tablets, light boxes, etc., are used with reference. Caravaggio, Vermeer, Rockwell, realistic prose, all use these legit tools of the trade for their work. Reference isn't swiping. No need to comment on it further. On my end, best Arthur." He just couldn't let it go. He had to bring people like Norman Rockwell and Caravaggio into it. And yes, some of those painters did employ projection as part of their painting process, but to be fair, that was projecting an image they had drawn onto a larger or more challenging surface for stuff like frescoes and murals. Not quite the same thing as Suydam's talking about here at all. Whether Suydam eventually took responsibility for his actions and the communication between he and Maziano remained civil or not, what followed behind the scenes isn't really clear. There were no further follow-up articles published, and it seemed like this had been covered because people saw Suydam as a joke rather than having been actually upset by it. What is clear, however, is that the image of Suydam's deceased forecover was a digital manipulation of Maziano's original photograph of Brian Boland's Killing Joke cover. Of that, there was no question. While the rest of their exchange or the fallout of those conversations was never made public, there was one remaining bit that saw print. In a final Bleeding Cool article, it was revealed that during these behind-the-scenes conversations, Arthur Suydam explained to Anthony Maziano that the image, which had been run for the solicitation on the Comic University website, wasn't actually the cover for the issue. According to the article, Suydam went on to claim he'd only been given, quote, 2 days to provide something for the solicitation, and since he was planning on using his photo as a reference anyway, Suydam somehow, while this never seems to have been publicly addressed, felt it was okay for him to use the manipulated photo for a solicitation image of what he claimed was his cover. If this is the case, though, it doesn't explain Suydam's own response to the entire situation, justifying tracing at the time of the solicitation's release. It just doesn't add up. While this smacks of someone trying to cover their butt once they've been caught and called out, and I don't know exactly how this all played out between Maziano and Suydam, clearly Maziano continued to refuse to allow Suydam's use of the image. While I never uncovered the full details of what followed, I can say that Maziano seems to have never backed down with almost complete certainty, because if you look, the cover image that ended up being used as the deceased 4 variant cover is indeed an entirely different cover, and one which does appear to have been painted. For a guy who talked about not spinning the truth and the importance of honesty so much, Suydam had a lot going against him at this point. This final snafu would be the straw that broke the camel's back, ensuring that from here on out, he would only be employed by a single publisher. While it had certainly already been commissioned and paid for prior to all of this, another Arthur Suydam deceased cover for issue 5 did run only a month later. The Batman image used wasn't another new composition, rather unsurprisingly given what had taken place with the Killing Joke cover, but instead another old image that Suydam had been commissioned to create for Heroes Con years prior, in this case before, I believe. While it wasn't even a new painting, people couldn't help but start to pick apart and analyze the painting, and it wasn't long before someone was actually able to pick out the exact Frank Frazetta piece that Suydam had lifted the legs and much of the upper torso as well as part of the left arm from. By this point, I think a lot of individuals were pretty well on the lookout for Arthur Suydam, and a lot of people took a certain morbid enjoyment from picking apart Arthur Suydam's images and figuring out where they had actually come from. And then, of course, publicly sharing this information with anyone and everyone that they could while making fun of him for it. In the case of Deceased 1, Suydam seems to have taken a slightly different approach than his usual straight swipe antics. As a result, while it did take people a little longer, they eventually found out about the stunt that he'd pulled on that cover as well. Suydam's cover for the first issue of Deceased is a homage of Alex Ross's Immortal Batman Harley Quinn cover, as I said, immediately thinking he probably used Ross's original as his basis for a digital overpainting. People quickly began comparing the two. It was obvious from a cursory glance this wasn't the case though, and then people quickly pulled up Anthony Mazziano, aka Harley's Joker, cosplay image recreation of Ross's cover, for obvious reasons. Once the images were overlaid, it was determined that Mazziano's image hadn't been the source either. For a short time, it seemed that Suydam might have just either come up with this terrible cover on his own, or more likely, finally managed to beat the internet at their own game. Given the absolutely horrendous quality of the image, personally, I thought this might be what an original Suydam looked like at this point, given the continued downturn in his art over the past 2 decades. As it turned out, the Deceased 1 cover wasn't pulled from the original Ross cover or the cosplay recreation by Anthony Mazziano, but it had been traced. After some time staring at the image, knowing there was something familiar about the image they couldn't quite put their finger on, some random internet user finally figured out what it was. While he hadn't used the Ross or the Mazziano image, Suydam instead apparently just used a literal still frame of Margot Robbie from Suicide Squad itself. When the image from the film was overlaid with Suydam's own painting, there was again no denying this was where the image of Harley Quinn's face for the piece had come from. Well, you might imagine this would have raised some eyebrows, and people would have started bashing on Arthur Suydam again. You'd be wrong. While there was a Bleeding Cool article ran about the Deceased 1 cover, the painful truth is that by 2019, nearly 13 years after his initial wave of success surrounding Marvel Zombies, no one cared anymore. There was basically zero interest in his work from readers, collectors, publishers. DC hadn't had him back since his departure from them in the 70s. Marvel wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole following the fallout from Tablegate and his very public run-in with Bill Sienkiewicz anyways, and if they would have ever even considered having him back prior to the Deceased cover incident, there was no way Marvel was ever going to bring Suydam back after that. Even Dark Horse hadn't published a Suydam piece in more than 20 years. Suydam was completely washed up. He wasn't even considered a has-been. No one even remembered him well enough for that. Instead, he was quickly becoming little more than a bad joke. He really was nothing more than that Marvel Zombies guy. His career should have been over. He should have been out of work and with nowhere to turn. Some of the stuff that Arthur Suydam had done and said by this point was nothing short of absolutely appalling. From his marginalization of other industry talent to his trashing on publishers that paid his paychecks and obviously trying to stir up crap between talent and publishers while at Penthouse, stealing art from other professionals, the truly disturbing part of this story, for me at least, isn't all the stuff that Arthur Suydam did, or that he got caught doing, or that he didn't get caught doing that we will never know about, but the fact that he's actually somehow, after all of this, still managed to sneak his way back into the comic industry. If I perhaps sound a little overly bitter about all of this, it's important to remember the type of rhetoric that Suydam spent the entirety of his time in the public eye spouting off about. He loved to talk a big game about how he had so much more integrity and had refused both money and eschewed fame in the industry in order to remain true to his artistic integrity instead. He had talked about comics being such a wonderful medium because of precisely how hard and how far they pushed the creative limits and boundaries of those that chose to work in that medium. He spoke at length about how he had chosen to remain and returned as often as he could because there simply was no other artistic medium in the world that required such an extensive skill set and provided such an incredible education in the field of illustration and perhaps art in general. He seemed to speak to and understand all of those things that makes comics so special to me. He seemed to be one of the few people in the industry with any understanding of what the medium was truly capable of and how those that participated in the field should be held to an incredibly exacting standard and cut no quarter when they were obviously working for a paycheck. This all made what took place with Arthur Suydam during the latter half of his career all the more painful for me. I had thought he understood, and perhaps he did. Perhaps he simply turned his back on all of that, and he once believed and preached like it seems. Suydam's official website described his career saying, quote, preferring to grow and create on the less lucrative fringe away from commercial pressures, Suydam enjoys the ultimate artistic freedom, the autonomy to follow his own aesthetic, developing styles, characters, and tales from personal experiences and limitless imagination outside of the confines of mainstream corporate limits. A consummate artist, Suydam has used his time to quietly build a body of work that is truly second to none. And Suydam said in an interview just prior to Marvel's Zombies in 2005, quote, comics is a great fertile place to practice and grow. What I love about comics is that there is so much drawing involved, that it's the best school for improvement there is. I've tried to direct my own career to utilize the comic projects to develop my own talents as an artist. I've seen artists get stuck in one thing for too long and actually digress. I try to choose my projects for their ability to challenge me and provide opportunities in areas where I feel I need to grow, at a sacrifice of taking more lucrative jobs, which has kept me out of the mainstream. What I get in exchange is a good education. My work is full of homages to my teachers and on-the-job lessons in areas I needed to grow in. Comics makes you draw every day, makes you paint, makes you develop as a writer. Cartoonists are the most creatively gifted individuals in the world. You practice being creative on a daily basis for 10 to 30 years, you better be good by age 50 or so. I can't think of another industry that provides that kind of growth opportunity. But for all of this, for all of his big talk and bluster, his fame and fortune at nearly 70 years old, there's just no way that you pull this amount of crap in public and walk away smelling like a rose. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. Not in this day and age. A lot of us, we follow these happenings, we record them, and then eventually we share them so that others don't make the same mistakes, stray down the same dangerous paths. And so snakes like this don't get to simply keep making convention appearances, signing books, drawing commissions, doing covers, and pretending like nothing happened. For me, that's unacceptable. While I suppose Suydam has been exiled from Marvel and DC, Dynamite obviously doesn't seem to care what he's done. Over the past few years, since he started working solely for that publisher, Suydam's provided covers for Kiss Zombies, which started in November of 2019, only months after the Deceased variant cover incidents, Death to the Army of Darkness throughout 2020, as well as Mars Attacks Red Sonja, where he provided a series of movie homage covers, Dynamite, where he even went so far as to homage several famous Marvel covers once more, and more recently in the past 18 months or so, Army of Darkness 1979, Red Sonja, The Price of Blood, Sheena, Jungle Queen, and Evil Ernie. As of the recording of this video, in June of 2022, Suydam's latest work couldn't be for a more apt title though. Dynamite never dies. I mean, you just can't make these things up. But judging from the list of work that he's done for that company over the past 3 years, I can't help but think we'll be seeing plenty more of Arthur Suydam. And honestly, I don't quite get how that's possible. Even if Dynamite is willing to overlook his sordid past and keep giving him work, we're talking about a special level of outcast here. I mean, Suydam might as well be a virtual pariah in the industry proper at this point. While I've seen it called two things, both inaccurately pronouncing his name, which is either Suydam or Suydam, and I saw him confirm both in interviews, just to be clear. But just like Robert Granito, Arthur Suydam has literally succeeded in transforming his name into a verb referred to as being or Sudamed. Ryan Stegman even publicly explained what the term meant in a series of tweets in 2015, wherein he also stated that they had come up with the term nearly 7 years before. According to Stegman, being can be, quote, 1, getting your table usurped, 2, photo manipulating an action figure for a cover, or 3, when someone runs out on the check. What's funny is there's no mention of Suydam stealing other people's work, and honestly, more than feeling super angry or aggressive towards the artist, it really feels like Arthur Suydam has become a kind of laughing stock among most of the comic industry proper and a large portion of his previous fan base as well. I'd always heard stories of Suydam and wondered why it was that he seemed to simply fall off of the face of the planet periodically over the years. The deeper I got into this entire thing, though, the more obvious and numerous those reasons became. Aside from his personality alone, some of the antics Suydam's been involved with over the years are truly mind-blowing for someone who claims to have had such an impeccable and impressive background and pedigree. The one thing that's kept him around, though, having achieved a Robert Granito level of infamy, as I mentioned, is that Suydam did what Robert Granito never had the stones to. He leaned into it hard. He never backed down. He never apologized. Hell, I still don't think he believes he ever did anything wrong to this day. Denial ain't just a river in Egypt, folks. His response to the deceased forecover alone, explaining that Caravaggio traced images, trying so hard to explain why he should matter and how great he truly is, makes it clear that Arthur Suydam isn't going to stop anytime soon. Why would he? He seems to have found a happy and healthy home for himself at Dynamite, who have been pumping out Suydam covers at an astonishing rate for a number of years at this point. So the next time you stroll past a random painted cover at a local comic shop, be careful giving it a second look. You might just end up getting s***ed. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know if you really enjoyed what you saw. Make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere. Again, if you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, updates, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel, if Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. You can finally sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and make sure to select the tier and the perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, you can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below. And you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting Service, as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I seriously want to thank every single one of you that supports the channel and helps make these videos possible, with a super special thanks to my loyal Wednesday warriors, Channel 10, Chasen, Clinton, Salvini, and Mike Dolan. I really hope the quality and content is getting better, and I can't wait to see where this next year takes us with your continued support. Thank you again for helping this crazy dream of mine become a reality, and for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep it in those local shops, and keep reading comics.